Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, February 28th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined by three area pastors who are with us today to talk about religion in society today and how that fits into where we're at as a culture and society. So it's a great pleasure to have with us today Pastor Donna Jackson, who is from Rupert, Vermont, but is the pastor at the Fort Miller Reformed Church in Fort Edward, New York. Dave Fredrickson is the pastor at the Zion Episcopal Church in Manchester, and Jeremy Means-Koss is the pastor at St. James Episcopal Church in Arlington and St. Peter's in Bennington. Wanted to thank you all very much for making the time for this conversation today. I really appreciate you all making the time for it.
Thank you.
And just sort of as a prelude to what I think is going to be a very interesting conversation between the four of us here, by way of a backstory, I guess you could say, this was a show I had hoped to do 4 years ago and had plans to bring together three area pastors to talk about religion in American culture today. And well, we could never find the right time for it, and everybody was too busy one day or another. And then in the middle of March of 2020, along came COVID. And but needless to say, that plan got put on hold and it turned into permanent hold. So I'm really happy 4 years later, almost to the day, to be able to kind of pull this conversation together. It pertains to something I've thought about a lot, which basically centers around the idea of what seems to be collapsing faith in public institutions that when I was a younger person many years ago seemed to be kind of ironclad in terms of people's faith in things like the news media, public health, government, organized religion. We could probably name several things, but I think you get the basic idea. And so I guess I just wanted to start by having us all maybe talking a little bit about, where you see organized religion kind of fitting into our culture today. And I guess the point that kind of stands out to me a lot is church attendance. Again, to go back to an earlier period in my life when I was going to Sunday school, told that I had to go to Sunday school all the time. It wasn't always what I wanted to do on Sunday morning, but, I didn't have much of a choice, but that was okay because Sunday school turned out to be a lot of fun. But I remember going to, Sunday school with all my friends, and then we'd have to stay for the service, and the churches would be full. The last time I was a sort of a regular attendee in church, that didn't seem to be the case anymore, and I often wondered why. What happened over the course of 50, 60, 70, or longer years to have changed that? So, Pastor Donna, let me start with you, if I may. Well, what are your thoughts around that? Do you preach to a full house on Sundays?
Never. I've been ordained for 16 years, and I've been serving rural churches throughout those years. So my forte has been the small country church that is struggling, and they want a pastor to be their savior and to bring them back to life. And in the 16 years of doing this, I realized that that is the wrong vision, that we need to really just assess where we are. And Jesus didn't preach to the masses. It was more relational, one-on-one. And so I think being small is okay. And so I think that when we start to talk about the state of the church today, that we have to stop that dialogue of, it was once packed. So I never preached to a packed congregation, never. And I'll be honest with you, has it bothered me? Yeah, there are some Sundays that it really does bother me. But then I have to step back and realize God is doing something new. I don't know yet what that new thing is, but I don't think the church is irrelevant. Maybe the institution that we have packaged it into is irrelevant. But church, there is a hunger for people to have faith, to hold on to something. There's a hunger for community and for connection. And I don't know why our institutional churches were failing, it seems, at that. But I know that there's still, people are still out there who want to connect with another person and have that hope in the world. So I never preached in my 16 years to a full house. And I've learned that that's okay. And I'm still grappling and still trying to see what that new thing God is doing. But I will say this, Andrew, I think it all comes down to being authentic. I think our churches, organized religion, we need to be authentic. We need to be real. We cannot be afraid to show our flaws, to show our weaknesses. And I think people want that authenticity that the churches perhaps are not allowing that space to be. And I say that because I have an online YouTube channel. I wouldn't say ministry, well, maybe it is, but where I just share the God moments and the beautiful, Vermont scenery, and I love 18th century history. So I share all of that, and the response that I get, people love it, and they call me Pastor. They're like, "Thank you, Pastor Donna." It's a joke because we were discussing our titles, and I noticed in my churches a lot of people don't address me as Reverend or Pastor anymore. It's just Donna. And that's also a change from, say, the 1950s, 1960s. But online, the online community that I have begun, that is church. People are thanking me and asking for prayers, and they thank me for my vulnerability. I just share what's on my heart. And to me, it has only happened recently that I've been getting that feedback from this channel of mine. It made me realize that there's still work for the church to do, but in a different way, a different venue, a different way to communicate and reach people.
Pastor Dave, what's your thoughts on that?
So I appreciate what Donna just said, and I agree. I think that the spiritual hunger hasn't waned at all. I would argue that too.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of factors, I think, why the church is declining in attendance. And I'll name three major ones off the bat. I think one of them is how mobile our society is, right? So I'm 60. I've been ordained 25 years, and I grew up in a small town in Colorado. And I went to the same church that my parents grew up in, the same church that my grandparents grew up in, the same church that my great-grandparents actually helped to build, right, in this little town. So it was a part of our family identity to be a part of this church, right? But over the last, 100 years ago, that was the case, right? People pretty much remained in their communities, and the church was a part of their life. Well, the transient society that we live in today, it's very difficult to have that kind of experience. So you don't identify with a family church any longer, per se. And when you move to a new community, a new town, it's hard to break in sometimes. Churches can be kind of cliquey. They can be sort of judgmental at times, right? So it's hard to break into a new community, and a lot of people just don't even try. So I think the transient nature of our society is one thing. I think the second thing is the loss of the blue laws, right? I mean, back when I was a kid, stores and restaurants, they weren't open on Sunday. In fact, in some places, it was against the law to be open on Sunday. So there wasn't as much to do on Sunday. You go to church. I went to church. I went to my grandma's house for dinner. That was a very simple life. But that's today, the busiest shopping day of the week is Sunday. I mean, statistically speaking. So the loss of blue laws has certainly impacted church attendance. And I would say the last thing is the last one I'll raise up. There are many more, but it's just the degree of affluence in our culture that is just different than it was 100 years ago, 50 years ago. People have so much more discrepant or disposable income. And so on Sunday, there's a lot of things they would rather do than go to church, frankly, and they have the means to do that. So that's what I would say are three major factors that contribute to the loss of church attendance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Pastor Jeremy, what are your thoughts on all this?
I'm sensing I might be the Debbie Downer, the of the group.
Well, someone's got to do it.
Yeah. And I think in comparison, I've only been ordained for 4 years, and so I have a much different, I think, longitudinal perspective in terms of in ministry. I think one of the things that I feel like I've noticed is that it's not necessarily. I think the attendance is better reflecting where people are at. There's this pretend myth that George Washington, went to church, and there are 2 churches in Virginia that claim. I mean, I interned at one of them, right? Like where we had a plaque of George Washington, and the reality is he only put his butt in the pew 4 times a year because his wife dragged him there. But we hold him to this goodly Christian account. And how many robber barons, how many industrialists went to church regularly and yet still pilfered from the American landscape? My point being, I think people now are just being authentic with the fact that they're like, I don't care about church, and there's no social pressure to make me be there. Right. Whereas in the past, there was this social pressure to say, if you weren't in church, we were going to judge you as a society. We were going to say, what's wrong with you? You weren't there. You weren't seen. Whereas now, that social pressure isn't there. So people are free to be more authentic about the fact that they just don't care. I don't think that it's a question of people now not caring the way that they did in the past. I just think that they're not being openly criticized for not being present the way that they were in the past, which I think is actually really good.
Yes.
And I think it's really good because it means that we as an institution, and to be clear, I think that the church, lowercase c, will never die, because that is the church of the believers. So you don't need a building, you don't need Zion, you don't need St. James. We are independent of the lowercase church. Churches, the institutions themselves, have to come to a reality to say, are we actually impacting people and helping God transform them into becoming better people, thus there being an actual value added for why they should show up? Or are we just hoping that they do show up because they used to show up?
Right. I would love to jump in. I'm so glad that you said that, because we like to talk about the good old days and when the churches were packed. But the question that I always have, because I love history and I would love to delve into it, if we gathered a discussion of people, say, from the 1700s or the 1600s or whatever the time was, okay, even 1950, if we had them at the table and asked about their views of church and be honest, how many would say, yeah, I love it, I really want to be there? They might say, we're doing it because of social pressure, social norms. So I'm so glad that you named that. That is wonderful. And, just going back to attendance, again, we in the church, organized religion, the institution, we have a different definition of what healthy attendance is. But research shows, I think it was Pew or maybe Barna, that if you asked a church person, what do they consider regular attendance? It's twice a month. It's not every Sunday.
Right.
So I think that we, in the institution of organized religion, that we need to start really listening to the people and not, we need to get into the trenches. And I've served denominations at the national level, Presbyterian, now UCC. And what I often see is at the national level of an organized institution, religious institution, and I'm going to say it too, there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect between, what their vision is or agenda and what's really happening right there in the trenches and the people who are hungering. And so how do you get the people in power? Even in religion, there's people in power and politics. And so we're also fighting that as well, in terms then of trying to then get that message out there and give the people what they want, or if they're hungry, to be that presence. How do we do that? So there's just so much that is on my mind lately. So I'm so glad that you named that.
And I want to add to that too, because I think the whole social pressure piece of it, you know, historically, I would say it's sort of always been there, but certainly in a post-war period, right? I mean, you know, we're in the midst of the Cold War, right after World War II, and Eisenhower was president, and he was the first, and to my knowledge, the only president to be baptized in office. And the message was that to be a good American, you need to be a churchgoer, because we're fighting this godless enemy, right? The communists, right? And so so the church, sadly, the gospel became caught up with this idea of national pride in some sense in the 50s and 60s, and of course, you know, people came back from the war. They wanted something better for their children. They wanted a peaceful world. Women were who had put so much time and effort into the war effort no longer had a job after the war, so they just flocked to the church and created all these church organizations. And so the church was sort of a real beacon of people's attention, and then you threw on that the whole idea of being what being a good American was to be a good churchgoer. In fact, that's when I think under God was put in the Pledge of Allegiance, was during the 50s, right? So I mean, it was just this strong push to make the church sort of validate the society or the culture or the national agenda. And now we're four generations removed from that one, right?
Are we?
Right. I mean, my parents were the greatest generation from post-war.
Right. But I push back a little bit. Are we? Because there's that Christian nationalism now that we're
right. No, and so that brings up some.
Yeah. Sorry.
That brings up a whole other conversation that's really, really good. And
I'm sorry. Yeah.
You're absolutely right about that. Yeah.
What I hope we get into before we're done. But I guess I was just wondering. Well, I've often thought. Do you think? And I'm sure all your churches probably do this to some degree already. If there were like other services that churches might offer, like I don't know, maybe food distribution to needy people, or helping students who are struggling in school, or I don't know, there must be all kinds of social services that maybe churches are already doing. I tend not to think about it in that way, but are those sort of avenues? And Pastor Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in your book here, Being Church in a Liminal Time, which is available on Amazon and also in other bookstores, which I found a fascinating read, by the way. I think you talk a little bit about this, about how churches can expand the range of offerings, as it were, to bring more people back into the building, in addition to the sort of the spiritual hunger that people still feel and that connect them to some kind of spiritual feeling as well. Is that something you think they should explore a little bit, or is that kind of just one more thing that just is adding to an already weighty burden?
Well, I think churches that are actually vibrant are churches that are connected to their neighborhoods, right? I mean, churches are local for a reason, and they're local to reach out to their community, their local community. And not to say we don't have, you know, a wider lens than that, but churches that engage people from their local community tend to be more vibrant, I would argue, and I think you'll see that. I think you see that maybe in all of our communities, our congregations. We have programs in which we distribute food and tutoring for children, and you know, those kinds of programs exist within churches. Putting up homeless people as an example during the winter months. Thrift shop where people can find clothes for no money or very little money, right? I mean, churches are continuing to do that, but I think the difference is that one thing churches have failed to do well, I think, is to actually understand who their neighborhood is, who lives here, and what are they about? What do they care about? You know, and where is God at work in this neighborhood or in this community? And how can we get on board with that, with whatever's happening there? And I think a lot of churches are kind of stuck we get stuck in our old ways of doing things, in our old ways of thinking. And so um, certainly not intentionally, but unintentionally, we become a place that's not welcoming sometimes for the local community. And I think that's one of the problems that we're trying to overcome.
I have a quick story or illustration about that. When I was serving a congregation in Maryland, I noticed a hard time of connecting with the community. There just was a disconnect. And so in the downtown area, there was an empty storefront. And I thought, it was around the holidays, and I presented to the mission committee, hey, why don't we see how much it is to rent it just for, say, November, December, and all those items that we have for our rummage sale, rather than put it in the church fellowship hall, why don't we rent this storefront in this, struggling downtown, and create a Christmas shop where the merchandise is like $1, $2, 50 cents, so that people who are struggling, it's not a handout or something free, but they have some pride in that they were able to buy something for their child, rather than that's the other thing. We tend to forget that sometimes we think that we're helping and maybe we're not. But so I presented this idea to the mission team, and their answer basically was, why would we do that? We already have a dollar store in the area. And I had to say to them, this idea is not for the people in the community right now. It's more for us to get ourselves out there so that we can meet them and hear their stories and really be there and know our community. It's for us to get out there. So needless to say, we didn't do it. And needless to say, I came back to Vermont and I left Maryland. So there you go.
As a Marylander, that makes me sad.
We'll talk later.
Yeah. I think what's interesting, back in 2012, the former Archbishop of the Church of England, Rowan Williams, said in an interview that we are officially in a post-Christendom environment, meaning that culture is no longer, for whatever you may want to say about Christian nationalism and whatever, that we are squarely in a post-Christendom culture. And what's liberating actually about that is that I think it focuses us back on what Donna is saying, because I don't remember who published it, but something like more than $5 million is being saved on the Washington, D.C. Public service budget because of the work that the religious organizations are doing for social services. That it actually, from a secular perspective, saves the government money in social services, right? And that's proven across the fact. I don't know if that number is still true. I don't know what that number looks like in communities over here. But religious organizations save the secular government's money with the social services we do. That's a secular perspective. But as to what Donna is saying, like whenever someone says to me, oh, let's do X program, if they're internal, if they are within the church, my first question is, what does that have to do with Jesus? Not like should or shouldn't we do the program, but more specifically, why is Jesus calling you and us into that ministry, so that we can articulate that we aren't GBICs, we aren't a regular secular social service, that we do this from a very different place. Yeah. We do this grounded because we feel like God is calling us into this for real work and a real reason. And I think in a post-Christian world, in a post-Christian culture, naming that for ourselves so that it can be articulated to other people is critical in the survival of our church. Because if Joe out there is like, oh, well, you're just another social service, that doesn't continue to grow the institutions. Exactly. It just looks at us as another secular service, which is, I think, a lot of ways that people do look at us, that we are just another service provider.
And that's a really good point. There was one rural town that I served in, and the church at that time, we were doing some things, offering programs for kids and whatnot. But it was an aging congregation, and their focus was on survival. And needless to say, they're still trying to survive. Well, looking back at that community, maybe some 5 years after I left it, I noticed that the churches that used to do so much for the community aren't doing anything, but it's the secular organizations that are doing what the churches once did. So the library installed a refrigerator to offer food to people. The library. The local artist studio opened up the doors to a Friday after school program for the children. That's what the church used to do that I served. And so it goes back to how do we be the church today, or how do we get the church to be relevant when we're still, so many are still stuck in a model that never was sustainable and still stuck in self-preservation, survival. And I think that's a challenge for we who are called to be leaders and leaders of the faith. How do we try to overcome that or lead the people or open up a new vision? I think that's why you're seeing a lot of pastor burnout too. People who are called into ministry are now, they no longer stay very long. It used to be, for Presbyterians, it used to be 20 years, 30 years the pastor was pastor. That goes back to people stayed, Now it's 3 years. And I'm trying to tell these congregations who are struggling that when you're looking for your next pastor, chances are they're just going to stay for 3 years. So you as a church need to know how to lead, because you're always going to have leadership that is transient as well. And so, that's the other thing. There's, Andrew, we need to have a series here, because there's Christian nationalism, there's clergy burnout, and there's also people who are not entering into being clergy. There's low, enrollments now in seminaries that a lot of denominations are now looking at as well.
There's enormous clergy shortage across the board, actually.
Is there? Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure.
Every tradition is struggling with finding clergy to serve.
And so my question is then, why are the next generation of those who are called to serve the faith, they're not choosing to enter into traditional ministry? A graduating class, they did a survey, I think it was Princeton Theological, and when they did the survey, most of the graduates said that they had no intention on taking a church job, but going into nonprofits or other type of organizations. So when you touched on the fact, how do we stand out from just being another organization that's helping?
So what's interesting, so I also serve on our diocesan committee for ministry, which looks at raising people up for ordination and things like that. And one of the things that we talked about is that one of the models, so in the Episcopal Church, we have what's called ASA, your average Sunday attendance. And that's one of a numerous, but one of the metrics that we use to see, like, how are you doing, right? And in that conversation, in that committee, we talked about another potential qualitative metric of how, if a parish is thriving, is how many people in your congregation are blossoming into desire for ordination, desire for, lay leadership in, like, how many people are feeling a call to do something in your church. If you've got people hand over foot, clamoring to become clergy or become lay leaders or do something, then it doesn't matter if you've got 5 people in church or 5,000 people in church. You've got a great, thriving, transformational experience. But if nobody is doing that, then that might be something to look at. And I think from colleagues, coming from that new perspective, because I have colleagues who are like, I don't want to do that. I want to do this and I don't want to do that. And the reason, and I was even one of those people who thought I was going to go into college chaplaincy. My career before this was in student affairs. I thought I was going back into that environment. And things didn't work out. And through a series and years of exploration, decided to go into parish ministry and fell in love with it once I was there. But the idea of the idea of dealing with a bunch of people who want to tell me what works or doesn't work in their church and what we used to do and those kinds of things, the finances, all of the things which are not what you would call like scriptural, inspirational type of work, wasn't ever sold to me along the journey. And so I think what we in seminaries, we in denominations, we in on the institutional level can do is like sell that again to people, because the things that new clergy want to go into are they want to be chaplains in X, or they want to be therapists in Y, and because they think of it as only, or retreat, like they only want to be in singular aspects of what they think being a pastor is. And I think the two of you would agree with me when you say it's actually some of the most important work we do is in the finance meeting, where we say, okay, this is how much money we have to work with, and how can we transform our surroundings with it.
Exactly.
Right.
But that's a finance meeting. That doesn't get sold to a seminarian, right? Like,
But I think that goes back to the structure of our churches. They're so based on the secular model that they look at it as a finance meeting. And I've been in those churches where this is a finance meeting, Pastor. Why are we praying? It's like, whoa, you know. And so for me, on the journey of being a pastor, of entering into the church and to look at everything that is done from, you know, janitorial to the finance to whatever, for me, it's always been, where's Jesus in this? Where's God in this? How, almost like, was it Brother Lawrence, the monk, that saw everything that he did as worship, and he peeled the potatoes, and that was very important, and that was worship. And so, you know, not to just say, okay, it's the finance meeting, God doesn't have a place here. And I think a lot of churches are still in that secular business model of running a church when I'm trying to find the spiritual.
But I would say, too, that it's not just the churches that are in the secular model. The seminaries are forming clergy as professionals, right? I mean, the professional model of forming clergy has been around since the post-war period. And I had an interesting conversation with Brian McLaren once when I was telling him it took me 10 years to be ordained, because I switched denominations. I was a Presbyterian, I became an Episcopalian, I had to jump through hoops on this side, and then I had to jump through hoops on this side. And Brian looked at me, Brian McLaren's a spiritual writer. He said, "Isn't that completely ridiculous to you?" And I said, it is completely ridiculous to me, but I had to do it to be an ordained priest, right, in the church. And so I think a lot of people are looking at how clergy are formed, and the professional model in which clergy are formed, as something that they're just not willing to give their time and energy to. You don't want to have to deal with all the hoops you jump through to get so I can do this thing. Right. And so there's a breakdown from even forming clergy that we need to look at in terms of, you know, what is the model in which we operate our institutions from? Is it a business model, or is there actually a biblical model or a more spiritual model that we can utilize that will give more life to finance meetings and clergy formation, as an example, right?
Yeah.
What I think is fascinating is that we think, like in the past, if you were born an Episcopalian, you would then stay an Episcopalian and you would die an Episcopalian, right? Like that was just the model.
Socialized.
And in this, you didn't choose to do this. You didn't even know you were doing this. But at your table, of your three guests, you have someone who's lived in both the Presbyterian and UCC, if not more, right?
More. Grew up Congregationalist, started my ordination as RCA, Reformed Church in America, switched over to be PCUSA, worked for the Episcopalians, and I'm now working with the UCC. So yeah, I don't have any allegiance to any one denomination.
But there's transience is
Exactly.
right, like, so it's not just that people are being transient in their location and townships. They're like, people are being transient in faith. And of the three clergy, you have three. You just admitted to being PCUSA to Episcopalian, and I was evangelical, and now I was hardcore evangelical until now I'm an Episcopalian. And so I think the transience is a factor of this era that has never before been a factor. I mean, it hasn't been a factor since the dawn of the church in, you know, post Jesus, before Rome like decided when people were being converted. But like it is a dynamic that I think we are still, as denominations and institutions, learning how to grow into.
And I think it's interesting too, because you're the young one here at the table. Okay, I'm feeling my age here. Okay, but you're the young one, and I've had a conversation with young clergy. I've been ordained 16 years of second career, and they look at people like me as a clergy, and they're like scratching their heads, like, I don't understand these conversations about church growth and lack of people in the pews. Like, I just don't understand any of this, because this is what I was born into. So they don't know of the time when churches were more robust. And so I find that interesting too, that we're talking, or maybe having a conversation about the state of the church that the next generation really can't understand, or they're not having that conversation. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe this is just the reality. And so what do we do with the reality that is now, rather than having that history? I don't know. Am I making sense?
There's an unwritten kind of cultural acceptance that a curse word around me is what we used to do. But like, I cringe when I hear that, because it's not about, because we will never be able, nor should we really want to recapture the past. The question is not what did we used to do, it's what do we feel called and drawn to do,
Right.
and have we done something similar to that in the past to help us guide like metrics or budgets and things like that. But trying to recapture what we used to do is anathema to progress.
Right.
Right. Well, that's sort of what we wrote about in this book, right? I mean, Jeff Jones is a retired Baptist minister, and I are good friends. We taught together at Andover Newton for 4 years. So we taught clergy leadership, and really what we talk about in this book is that there are really, we break it down in like 3 different images of church. One is a remembering church, right? And that's these churches that say, I remember when the pews were full. We had lots of kids on Sunday. I remember when. And we keep going back to that, and they refuse to get past that, right? And there's a lot of churches that are stuck right there. The second image is a letting go church. So a church says, you know what? We're not going to survive. We're too small. The community around us is changing too much. So let's just make the best of it, right? With the time we have left, let's get out of the denial. We're not going to make it. But tell you what, let's make the best of this. Kind of like a person that goes on hospice care, right? I mean, that's the image that we use. And the third image we use is a church that's resurrecting, and that's a church that's not afraid to throw away. Well, everything's on the table, right? Everything from the tradition to the sacraments, right? It's all on the table, right? I know.
I just had a heart attack.
I know I'm giving you a heart attack.
I'm like, yeah, all right. So talk about being different.
And this idea that we've got to figure that God is doing a brand new thing. We don't know, none of us know what that is.
Right.
And we may not know what that is for 100 years, quite frankly. None of us have a clue, but God is up to something. And so a church that's resurrecting is a church that needs to figure out, put it all on the table and say, where's God leading us here?
But you know what? I thought God was up to something with the start of COVID when it comes to our churches. I thought, COVID was horrible, and I wouldn't want us to go through that again. But for me, it was a spiritual moment. I thought it was the wake-up call for our churches, because prior to that, I kept saying, for the small rural churches that I knew in my little network of Presbyterians, before COVID, I pitched the idea of being a modern-day circuit rider. So rather than getting on a horse and going to different churches and serving all of them, I would be in one church physically, and the other churches we would zoom in. Now, this was 2019, so this was still like a lot of churches were like, what, technology? And then COVID happened, and everybody was scrambling to get online. Mm-hmm. All these churches like, oh my gosh, I need a computer, I need to do this. So for me, I thought that was that pivotal moment of God is breaking through with a new thing, and all these years of saying we need to try something new or do something different or not be afraid where the Spirit is leading. I thought perhaps this was our time of wilderness, go out and commune with God and really see that new vision and then emerge from it as a new creation. I don't know about you two, but what I've seen is that many churches have just gone back to the pre-COVID way of existing.
with technology now.
With technology now.
Right, exactly.
With technology.
But maybe that's a step along the way, right? I mean,
Yeah.
You know, it's we all want it to be revealed tomorrow. It's not going to be revealed tomorrow. It's going to take a long time, just as in their last Reformation. We're in a Reformation, just like it was in the 16th century. Right now, every bit as significant as what happened in the 16th century. We're in a Reformation period, and we don't know where it's going to end up.
True.
I was wondering, just to build on a point I think you were making, Jeremy, about where churches should go into the future, and also the resurrection idea. I hear so much talk about particularly younger folks being anxious, having mental health issues. Just at a school board meeting recently where this subject came up endlessly, it seemed like, because they had taken on these financial obligations to hire more mental health professionals to help their kids who were struggling. Whatever, it was probably COVID related, but it struck me that it's like, oh, yeah, it's really goes beyond COVID. There's just something about the times in general that seems to be prompting this. And I wonder, is there a role for the church in sort of helping not just teenagers or younger folks, but people of all ages overcoming this sense of anxiety and concerns about where the world is going? I mean, you look around, there seems to be so much strife and conflict in so many places. Is that a direction you think that your churches might want to aim towards in some way or another? Not that I'm thinking you're going to solve the Middle East question or Ukraine versus Russia or anything like that, but is that something that might be, or maybe they're already are already doing that sort of thing?
I think it goes back to being authentic. I think our churches, we need to learn how to be authentic in the pews and with one another and not be judgmental, not be, for me, the church is the place to just let it all out and cry if you're going to cry. And you don't know how many times people say to me, oh, Pastor, I'm so sorry that I was crying. And it's like, this is the place to be. We hide our brokenness. And we're always comparing ourselves to one another, and I think that's a problem too with mental health, social media. I don't want to compare myself to a thriving church. As I said at the beginning of this conversation, I've never preached to a really packed church, and so I would go crazy if I was comparing myself to the real thriving churches. You just got to really be authentic and know that you're where you're supposed to be. But I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about authenticity and how do we just get off of all the technology, the social media. It has its place. It has its place. But how do we really show up for one another? And I think that is really important, especially for our young people too. How do we teach them, once again, the presence of being there for one another without judgment, without, with just, I don't know.
I when I was in my former parish in Plymouth, I was invited to be part of an opioid committee to deal with the opioid overdose crisis. And it was happening in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where I was before. And there was a lot of people around the table. There were EMS, police, fire. There was a drug court in Plymouth, so the judge was there. She's the one that actually convened the group, the head of the hospital. And nobody knew what to do with me. It was fascinating. I mean, everybody talked around me in this group because they didn't know what to do with me. In other words, they didn't see that the church had any sort of voice in this conversation at all. We talk, mental health people were there. So we're talking about mental health, and none of them saw that as a spiritual problem, right? They saw it as a social problem or a mental health problem or a medical problem. But none of them would even admit that there's a spiritual piece to this component as well. So it was very uncomfortable for me, I got to be honest, sitting on this committee when everybody's talking around me and showing deference, of course, but not really asking for any input. So it gets back to this question: is what is there? What kind of connection can the church make to the culture, the society that can help? And certainly, one of the things we can do is we have spiritual practices, right? That help people to cope in these times, right? And we can teach those things, and maybe we can do. I don't know. I mean, we have to think outside of the box, but certainly we have that to offer.
I'm glad you brought up the spiritual practices, because there is a Presbyterian church that I'm aware of in North Carolina. I was editor of a magazine, and so I got to interview a lot of these churches. And they started 3 years ago, they started a high school mental health group. And basically the teens are peers to one another. They're to help one another, and they're learning spiritual practices. So how to breathe, how to just be mindful, how to take a prayer walk, how to just really center yourselves and listen to other things, the spirit perhaps. So
Yeah.
I think you're right about the spiritual practices. That's where we start.
I think what's interesting is that yes, hospitals want to do good, but hospitals are also, they are about money. And I don't think that there is one like top line hospital that doesn't have a comprehensive chaplaincy program. And they may say that they have these programs because they care for their people, but they have those programs because statistically studies have shown that it saves the hospital money to have chaplains in the building helping their patients. It helps them get healthier, better. Like, there are studies, and that's why these hospitals have them. Like,
Really?
they're like, oh wow, this is actually saving us money to have clergy, to have not even just clergy, but lay people who work those chaplain roles
Right.
in the hospital, right? And so I think there is a very clear role, backed by studies, backed by, you know, institutions that have no religious desires, valuing what we do. But I also think that there is, and I think this is coming from like the being the youngest kid in the room type of perspective. I think there gets to be a change in the way that we talk about things, right? I have never had to hide under my desk thinking a bomb is going to be dropped on like where I've lived or my school. I never did a nuke bomb drop like thing. Now my parents did, but I didn't have to.
I did.
Okay, I haven't, so so I'm in my own age group here.
When I was in high school, I did a lot of like various diversity and stuff like that work, and I remember we would have to tell other kids that 1 in 4 women will experience sexual assault at some point in their life, right? I think the lie that we perpetuate is that this generation, that Gen Alpha, that Gen Z, that they are the most afflicted generation when it comes to what they have to deal with. That's not the case. The case is that they're just the ones who we have talked about it the most with and now think about. I mean, what would people who grew up in the Depression say about the hippies, right? Like we all pass judgment on those generations after us. I don't think that we're any less afflicted. I think we just have been talking about it differently. And I think by changing the narrative to say that it's not just this new generation dealing with something new, that it's actually all of us dealing with things and all of us having dealt with things, then it means that we recognize that it's always been a problem. And thus there needs to be not just a solution for this one person who's 11 years old, but a ongoing way that we handle it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Very good point.
Well, we are starting to run out of time, but I did want to just, before we had to run here, kind of touch upon one point that came up earlier about that whole evangelical movement, because it seems like, I mean, I guess I was living in some sort of cloud of oblivion here, but I missed that one until 4 or 5 years ago, I guess, when all of a sudden, you know, through following politics, you know, I began hearing about evangelical Christians being a powerful force. What? But I wondered, and again, this is a complicated subject. I'm sure we could easily have spent a whole hour talking about. But what is the driving force behind that, and where does it fit in, do you think, to our contemporary culture and religious structure? I mean. Well, Jeremy, I'll let you start with this since you said that was where you began your pastoral journey. I mean, what is the attraction and the dynamism that seems to be going on there?
So, yeah, I mean, it's not that it's apples and oranges. It's that the church that I attended had a seating capacity of 2,500, which was full and had 5 services. So every Sunday, right?
That's a lot.
That is, I will never. I don't know if I'll have that many people in the course of my entire ministry, right? Like, and so I think that there is first a recognition of what is going on depending on the size of the group that you're in, right? You can't have an intimate worship experience, an intimate commune experience when you are sat next to 2,500 people. But conversely, you can't feel like you are truly part of the next movement that is going to rock and change the world when it's you and 9 other people. When you are singing about Jesus next to 2,499 other people, you actually believe that change is possible because you are seeing faces of other people who desire that with you. And so I think what the evangelical church offered me and offers other people is the intersection of both an experience, a worship experience that is deeply relevant and part of their own musical and media inclinations, as it intersects, like being part of a mob in the best kind of way.
Mm.
Mm. Mm.
Interesting.
That's a tough question, and it's funny you said mob, because that's the first thing that came to my mind was mob mentality, and that sounded a little bit harsh. I didn't want to say that those. I didn't. It's a very hard conversation to have because I don't know. I'm going to defer to you.
Well,
There you go.
I think it's a hard question, actually.
Defer to him.
I was going to defer to him because Jeremy grew up in that whole world, but I do think it's important to recognize, though, that the megachurches are coming in all kinds of shapes and sizes. They're megachurches, they're big, but theologically speaking, they span the gamut, right? I mean, there are very progressive churches that are megachurches. There are very conservative churches that are megachurches, but I think that, but they're relatively new, right? I mean, my church has been around since 1782. Yours has been around longer than that. Your church has been around
1700s,
right? Yeah. So the proof's in the pudding. What's going to happen 50 years from now in these megachurches? The next, and I don't think any of us know the answer to that question. But I do think it's troubling that megachurches, that certain group of megachurches are politicizing, right? And they're connecting that way, and that's what we're talking about, Christian nationalism. And I do think that is an attempt to recapture the past, the post-war church again, and get people excited about that kind of a church that was both Christian and American, and I do think that within that structure is the seeds of their own destruction. I think when the church identifies itself politically, then it's sold its soul, frankly. And
but even without mentioning the mega churches or whatnot, I think it goes back to what you said earlier too about George Washington. He attended this church. Well, his wife did, and drag him along. And so we have this narrative of what this country was founded on, and when you really delve into it, know that the faith of our fathers, our forefathers, it wasn't what we think it was. So that ties into the fact that, wait a minute, what was their religion? What was their belief? Did they go to church every Sunday, or do they want to? And the very fact too that the small churches that I serve, with a handful of people, the fights that I have had because of the American flag in the sanctuary, and it's not prominent enough. And from my perspective, the question is, should that flag be there? Is this a church of, you know, the United States or of God, Jesus? And so when you start having those conversations, whew, it gets very tricky. And so it's just really woven tightly, I think, in a lot of our communities of Christian faith and being a good American or whatnot. And it just is just growing, and I don't know what the answer is, except that I, as a pastor, will always then just push back and ask the question, like, it's cliche, what would Jesus do? But, you know, talk to me a little bit more. I'll just ask questions. So why is this so important to you to have the American flag there? What does that mean to you? Why does it have to be here in worship? And there's been some good answers. You know, there's been some people that have some really heartfelt stories about losing loved ones in wars or whatnot. I'm like, okay. But then you talk about sacrifice and so forth. But you know, so on my level, in the small churches that I have served, yeah, I'm not dealing with the mega church question or Christian nationalism really like full blown, but there are times when I just have to push back a bit and just say, well, wait a minute. Tell me more about, you know, the American flag and the sanctuary, what you think, and what does the Bible say, and why are we really here? What is the vision that God has for us in this community to help others love one another as I have loved you? Who is my neighbor?
What's fascinating is that I'm the opposite side of that. I'm the one fighting to keep, like, not
Really?
I'm not fighting with anybody to do it. We still have it, but
Right.
I would argue with you to keep the flag in the sanctuary.
And why?
And the reason is because I think there needs to be like articulated reminders. So you don't just have it there, but you
Right.
have it there with articulated reminders that you, as a child of God, have a responsibility to every single person who lives in that flag, whether they believe or agree or not,
Oh, wow. Okay.
that Jesus calls you to have a responsibility to care for them.
Wow.
So that, like, and it comes from the idea of the parish, right? That, like, that we are a church, that is responsible to care for the region that we live in, regardless of who exists within it. And so, but I think it has to be, I think it has to be articulated, because I think without articulating it, then it's just God bless America.
Right.
When the reality is supposed to be, in my perspective, or a belief, is no, God bless every single independent person that lives in America. Therefore, you must care for them because that's what God calls you to do.
I love that. Oh my gosh, thank you.
That's good stuff.
Seriously, I walked away with a new perspective and something to share with my congregations. Wow. Thank you.
Yeah.
I knew that there's a reason we invited you to come.
I'm like, I love it.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Golly, you guys are too good. You're going to put me out of a job here if we have you come back. You know, this has been a fascinating conversation to listen in to and take part in. And I want to thank you all again for making the time for it. Donna Jackson of Fort Miller Reformed Church in Fort Edward, New York. Jeremy Means-Koss of St. James Episcopal Church and St. Peter's Church in Bennington. And David Fredrickson of the Zion Episcopal Church, and the other one in
There's St. John's Summer Chapel in Manchester Village. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks
you.
for having us.
Well, no, this was my pleasure.
Appreciate it
believe
very
me.
much.
And thanks to all of you for being with us as well and sharing part of your day with us. I hope you found the conversation remotely close to being as interesting as I did. Thank you again. We'll see you again the next time. Take care.